He has called Europe a decaying group of nations with weak leaders.
This is not because Russia is a sort of overwhelming economic powerhouse. Russia's economy is roughly the same size as Italy. And yet it's just not been a big priority.
Labour's budget was a budget for benefit street. It's rewarding the people that sort of turn their nose up at work on the backs of the people that go in and work. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here today. I'm joined by Daniel Freeman, our Managing Editor, and Julian Jessop, our Economics Fellow, who is joining us down the line. Now, there's been plenty going on this week, as always, not least Trump is fired another shot across the bows of the liberal international order. The customs union debate is raging again with more split debates and votes in Parliament, taking us straight back to 2017 and 2018. And Kemi Badenoch has made a speech on welfare. But let's start with Trump. So this week, in an interview with Politico, he has called Europe a decaying group of nations with weak leaders. He's taken aim at the immigration policies, particularly London, which he has singled out. This is alongside the publication of the National Security Strategy that the US have published, which warns of civilizational erasure in Europe. Dan, you've watched the whole interview. What were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, it's a kind of standard Trump interview. I mean, he's been around in the world political sphere for a decade now. We all know that most of his interviews are a sort of semi-coherent mix of stuff that is half true and stuff that is half mad, but with sort of quite funny bits spread throughout, so it's less of a chore to watch than it would be for a lot of politicians. So start off with bits that are half true or have important elements of truth. One of the big things he said, following on from a line of questioning about the war in Ukraine, about whether the US is going to continue supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. He said, well, the Europeans, they always like to talk about stuff, but they never produce, which I think is actually a big problem with politicians across Europe. And I include British politicians in this as well. He did focus quite a lot on immigration, but he also brought up energy, particularly Germany's energy policy. He said, Angela Merkel, I really liked Angela Merkel, but she had terrible energy policy, which, again, I think does get to something that is important and true about many European politicians, that many European politicians and countries seem to act as if we're still in the 1990s or early 2000s, where you can basically rely on the US for security, where growth is just something that happens automatically. And the whole purpose of politics is to do nice things that make you feel good about yourself as a nation. And in Germany's case, a big part of this is shutting down their last nuclear power stations in the context of an energy crisis. When you're relying on a country, you're kind of in a proxy war for a large amount of your energy, which isn't the sort of thing serious countries do. And this also plays out in the war with Ukraine. European countries have been repeatedly saying we're going to support Ukraine to the hilt. But in terms of changes to their economic setup, in changes to their energy policy, in changes to things like defense procurement, they haven't done nearly as much as you'd expect if you take their language seriously. So, we're almost 4 years in to this. And you've also, I think this sort of general attitude also explains why there's not been very much urgency about the lack of growth in Europe over the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm. I think that's entirely right. Julian, what's your take, especially on the economic aspect of this? Where does that come into this, do you think?
Well, first of all, on the economics, I think part of this is the backdrop in the United States itself. Obviously, the economy has done very well over the last few years, and actually surprisingly well in the first half of this year, despite the launching of a tariff war. But I think even people in the US are starting to get a little bit worried about, well, two things basically. One is that there seems to be a fairly sharp slowdown in the jobs market. So a lot of the whole Trump agenda was about bringing jobs back home. Well, actually, maybe some jobs coming back home, but many others are being lost, which is what you would expect when an economy becomes more protectionist. There's also been a very heavy reliance on the AI boom. So pretty much all of the growth in the first half of the year can be related to the technology sector in one way or another. And there's a bit of a pushback there, feeling that equity valuations have got overstretched. People are starting to get fed up about data centers in their backyard using up all their energy and polluting their water supply. So I think there are a few problems brewing at home. So what Trump is doing is the classic technique of pick fights with foreigners. There is a lot of truth in what he says about some of the structural problems in Europe, no doubt at all. I think he's right that we haven't addressed immigration policies very well. That's something that applies across the continent. But I'm not sure that Trump's solutions are any better. I mean, he's creating a very hostile environment now for legal migrants who will be contributing to the US economy. And the latest example of this seems to be this requirement to have 5 years of social media history presented on entry to the US, which is hard to square with all the commitment to free speech that apparently the US is a bastion of, but we're clamping on down here. So I think as ever with Trump, there's an element of truth in what he's saying, but I think he's going too far and going about solving these problems in the wrong way.
It definitely seems like there's plenty of examples of those in glass houses can't throw stones when it comes to so many of these issues. But I just want to highlight, and this I pulled this straight from a Times column by Daniel Finkelstein, so credit to him. But the difference in quotes between presidents. So John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address, said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty." Compare that with the new national security strategy, which says the affairs of other countries are our concern only if their activities directly threaten our interests. Our elites have badly miscalculated America's willingness to shoulder forever global burdens to which the American people saw no connection to the national interest. So it's fully taking that sort of properly protectionist, isolationist approach. Do you think, Dan, that there's we should be seriously concerned about the state of liberty on the international stage because of this?
I mean, yeah, the US imperial hegemony in the post-Cold War period especially was in many ways actually the high point of democracy around the world. You do see, especially after the end of the Cold War, you do see a flourishing of liberalization, democratization, an increase in trade and a freeing of trade. Both in formerly communist countries, but also in what was called the Third World. And that was largely dependent on the US being both an overwhelming economic power and an overwhelming military power. I think in the year 2000, the US alone accounted for 30% of world GDP. And it was a country that was basically interested in, by the standards of most other countries, interested in the maintenance of liberalism and democracy in a lot of countries around the world. I think it was always quite fragile because when you look at the longer history of the United States, especially before World War II and before that, isolationism is basically the default for the US, at least outside of the Western Hemisphere. And there was a big concern among Western European countries after World War II that the US was going to go back into isolation again. And that was a large part of the purpose behind creating NATO, was in order to ensure that the US was willing to commit to defense in Europe against the expansion of communism. Now, partly that's going to be weakened by just the lack of a clear ideological enemy in the same sense. Like, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party still rules China, but it's not a sort of ideological force in the same way that the Soviet Union was. Russia today is a heavily de-ideological, a very low ideology dictatorship. And so on some levels, Europeans, including us, should not be surprised that at some stage there was going to be a US reaction against this, where they say, well, why should we care? Why don't we just concentrate on the Western Hemisphere? Now, I think that withdrawal of the United States will be pretty bad for us, because it will mean, well, we're already seeing European countries are having to spend a lot more on defense than they previously did. I think in the long run, it will probably be bad for the United States, because a less stable world, a more unpredictable world, is bad for trade and for investment around the world, and that makes everyone poorer. But I don't think it should have come as a massive surprise, especially after, the first Trump presidency.
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of become a cliche now, the idea of this is a wake-up call for Europe.
Yeah.
The annexation of Crimea was a wake-up call for Europe. The first Trump presidency was a wake-up call for Europe. We've had so many wake-up calls now that you kind of have to start thinking, well, maybe the patient isn't sleeping, maybe they're dead.
It's pretty grim. Julian, to what extent do you think, we're quite at the IEA quite obsessed with economic growth and think that it would solve more than just the fiscal problem that we have, but plenty of other problems. How much do you think that if we could get the growth thing right in Europe, but also in America to an extent, how much do you subscribe to the growth theory of everything, that if we could just actually improve living standards and fix those key fundamental problems in the economy, that the problems with other things would settle down: immigration, crime, free speech, the protectionism in America, etc.?
Well, I think growth is a necessary condition for fixing those problems, but it's not sufficient. I mean, certainly we can't really do anything without growth. If you look, for example, at the longer term projections for the public finances, unless we can get some productivity-led growth soon, then debt is simply going to spiral out of control as a share of national income. So getting productivity moving is essential for the public finances. It's also pretty much the only way to have a sustainable increase in real wages. Obviously, if workers are more productive, they're worth more to their employers, and so that is the right way to boost the labour share of income, not simply dictating it by arbitrary increases in the national living wage. So growth is clearly a necessary condition for fixing lots of those social problems, but I don't think it's necessarily sufficient. If we take immigration, for example, if we're a relatively fast-growing economy, if anything, that makes us even more attractive for economic migrants to come here. So I think, if anything, that might increase the pressure on the borders that way, to the extent that is indeed a problem. So growth is part of the story, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. It also, of course, begs the question: where is the growth going to come from? And if you're constantly relying on it coming from government spending of one form or another, or sort of various short-term gimmicks, then you might get a burst of growth in the short term, but it soon peters out. And of course, that's what we've seen more recently in the economic numbers in the UK.
Which takes us on to the next topic that we want to discuss: the ongoing, never-ending Brexit debate has reared its ugly head again, as a vote in Parliament this week has been tied on whether we should basically return to the customs union or reapply to, or start a new customs union with the European Union. This is sort of interesting for multiple reasons: the political, but also the economic. Julian, you're the real expert here. First of all, the headline question: should we rejoin the customs union?
Well, short answer, no. Going back to basics, the idea of a customs union is basically that the members of a customs union agree that they're not going to have any tariffs on trade between member countries. But in order to make that work, they have to agree to apply the same tariff on all goods imported into the bloc. So it has some advantages and some disadvantages in terms of the impact on tariffs and so on. If we were to rejoin some form of customs union with the European Union now, though, those benefits would be very limited. I mean, so for a start, we've already got a very favourable free trade agreement with the European Union that is essentially tariff-free and quota-free, as long as the goods that you're selling into the European Union meet the appropriate rules for origin. Now, admittedly, that means that there is some tariffs on some trade. So if we try and sell things into the European Union that have a large element of them that has been made from outside the UK, then sometimes we have to pay tariffs. And also, if you're looking at lots of sort of smaller consignments of goods, sometimes it's just too expensive to prove that you meet the rules of origin. So there is still some tariffs on trade between the UK and the EU, but they are pretty small in the bigger scheme of things. The bigger obstacle is what economists call non-tariff barriers. So this is the various forms of red tape that you have to meet. And joining a customs union will get rid of some of that red tape, but not a lot, because as long as we're outside the single market, you still need border checks for things like the rules and regulations of the single market. You still have border checks for passports as long as we're outside the Schengen area. So the short point is that joining a customs union might have some small benefits in terms of tariff and non-tariff barriers, but they're not very big. Against that, there's some definite downsides. So first of all, if we join a customs union, we have to impose the EU's common external tariff on any other country we're doing trade with, which is basically going to mess up a lot of the new trade deals we've done with countries around the world, with the US, with India, with the Asia Pacific region. So we'd lose the benefits of those trade deals. And on top of that, we'd have no say on the future development of EU trade policy, even though we have to sign up for it. So we'd lose a lot of independence on regulatory policy, on trade policy. And again, holding back some of the benefits of Brexit. So I think overall my attitude to the customs union is maybe some very small benefits, but also some pretty substantial costs. And the biggest story here is, do we really want to go through all this process in reverse? Now, I'm a sort of Brexit optimist, but even I would accept that the process of leaving the EU was very painful, created lots of uncertainty, disrupted trade, the labour market, held back business investment. Do we really want to rerun that process in reverse? Tying up enormous amounts of civil service bandwidth, trying to negotiate itty-bitty agreements here and there that will have no real effect on the economy. Rather than stepping back and saying, look, we've left, let's focus on making most of the benefits that Brexit brings in terms of independent trade and regulatory policies. That's certainly the direction I would be going in.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it the case that actually there are negotiations ongoing between the CPTPP, of which we are a member now because we did leave the customs union in the European Union? That group is having discussions with the EU about how to sort of solve some of these problems, simplify rules of origin rules as well, so that maybe going to the table that way as part of a wider trade bloc that maybe they didn't have the political difficulties with would be a better way of having those discussions than one-on-one Brussels to London.
Yeah, well, I mean, so this argument tends to go through in two directions. So there's sort of lots of hardcore Brexiteers who say we shouldn't have anything to do with the European Union at all. At the other extreme, you've got the Lib Dems in particular who think that anything that's European Union is good and we should sign up to it straight away. I think there has to be a middle ground, which is to regard our relations with the EU the same as we do with any other country around the world. So if there is a deal to be done that works for both sides, we should go for it. And just because one party happens to be, the European Union, I think it should be neither here nor there.
Mm-hmm. Dan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Julian is one of the interesting things is how similar he sounded to both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves this week, who did pour quite a bit of cold water on this idea of joining the customs union. I think in part that's for the understandable reason that one of the few successes of Keir Starmer's time as Prime Minister so far, and sort of unequivocal successes that basically everyone agreed with, was negotiating the trade agreement with the US, which, while it's important to remember, the conditions we got from Trump are less favorable than we had before Trump became president, they are still significantly more favourable than the deal that the EU ultimately got. And then since then, we've also had a new agreement on removing tariffs on pharmaceutical products. And not just the US, you also have the agreement with India that was agreed a few months ago. So as Julian points out, you would have to give up those benefits. Now, some people would say that the advantages of reducing trade barriers and trade friction with our biggest market, the EU, which still remains by a fairly substantial margin our biggest trading partner, would outweigh the sort of relatively small advantages you get from a trade deal with, say, India. But we'll see. I think the other issue, the other reason this is kind of being pushed by some inside the Labour Party as well as some Lib Dems, is you've been seeing a lot of polling recently about the public's attitude to Brexit being like, oh, it was a mistake. And in fact, you get some polls that suggest you have actual majorities for rejoining the EU. Now, I think the Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, and actually quite a few other people, are sensible in that they probably see this as being a bit of a paper tiger, in the sense that people, overwhelmingly the public, think the economy is in a mess and think it's going to get worse. There's no major political party other than the Lib Dems and maybe the Greens who are sort of very pro rejoining the EU. So it's just a sort of reaction to be like, oh, well, everything's rubbish. Let's just go back to that. I think there's a risk that once there is actually a concrete proposal to rejoin the customs union, or even more so to rejoin the EU, people's opinions will shift back to more what they were previously. And also we've seen this with other policies. So digital ID, for example, where because the current government is so unpopular with the public, as soon as the government announces something as their policy, it loses a massive amount of support. So So digital the proposal ID cards or digital ID had sort of 70% support before it was government policy. And then as soon as Keir Starmer got up and said, we're going to introduce this, it fell to like 34% or something. And I think if Keir Starmer, next year stands up and announces, yeah, we're going back into the customs union, or we're going to have a second EU referendum, I think immediately you'd lose about 30% percentage points in support, because it is currently such an unpopular government.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can I just echo that and expand on one point? Although the opinion polls suggest that rejoining the EU or in some form is very popular, that's often only the headline question. If you dig down into the detail and explain to people what that might mean, or you explain what being a member of the European Union involves without saying this is being a member of the European Union, then the polls tell a very different story. So if you talk about, do you want open borders? Majority of the population says no to that. So that seems to rule out free movement, which is a condition of being a member of the single market. Do you want laws to be made in this country, for example? Most people favour that, but again, that's incompatible with joining the European Union. So if you dig below the surface, I don't think the polls are actually that convincing that there's strong underlying support for rejoining the EU. As Dan was saying, it's basically just people think things are in a mess and are clutching at any straw that they think might lift them out of that.
Yeah, that was right. I think the fact that the sort of even the headline numbers has changed is interesting in and of itself, and speaks more to the general disaffection with the economy and how everything's going at the moment than it does anything else. But not that long ago, any suggestion that anybody in the Labour Party, for example, was going to be pro rejoining some form of the EU, the Tories would have had an absolute field day. They would have thought all their Christmases would come at once, because that's the perfect attack line. A little bit different now, but as you say. think it was Robert Shrimsley in the FT wrote this week as well, that if Labour were to do that and decide that this is going to win them votes, it couldn't be Keir Starmer that was the one to do it. Partly because of his reverse Midas touch, but also partly because of his sort of background and things that I think he probably wouldn't have any credibility to do that. But moving on to a completely different topic now, more domestically focused. Kemi Badenoch, leader of the opposition this week, has delivered a speech on welfare, which is quite interesting. There was no hardcore policy in it. They're kicking off a campaign called Get Britain Working Again. But there's a few interesting threads in it, I think, that are worth discussing. One of which is the sort of return to the benefit street sort of approach to talking about this topic, basically saying that Labour's budget was a budget for benefit street. It's rewarding the people that sort of turn their nose up at work on the backs of the people that go in and work, do a hard day's work, etc., etc. But it also does a couple of other things, including it takes quite clear aim at talking about relative poverty as a measure, which we would agree. I think we've spoken about in this podcast before. But also trying to turn the sort of language on its head, the compassionate language that Labour and the left generally try and protect about, we're increasing benefits because it's the compassionate thing to do, but making work and helping people get into work be the compassionate element. Julian, I don't know if you saw or heard the speech or saw any reporting, but did you have any thoughts from the back of it?
Yes, I mean, two thoughts. First of all, I think that both those narratives from Kemi Badenoch are good ones. In terms of the benefit street stuff, I mean, that's a great political strapline, but there's an element of truth in it as well. I think it's fair to say that this government has pretty much given up on growth and is focusing instead on redistribution of income, with a lot more state intervention on top in all sorts of areas, whether that's energy markets, housing market, or labour market. So key sectors of the economy are becoming, dominated by, or even more dominated by the government than they were before. And I think we're inevitably seeing the consequences of that in terms of weaker economic growth, and it seems to have squeezed any positivity out of the private sector. And I think it's undoubtedly damaging incentives to work and save and invest. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. I'm also pleased to see a more sensible discussion around poverty and inequality. As somebody who follows the data closely, I find that the general level of public debate here really poor. So we're constantly being told, for example, that there's record levels of inequality in this country and that wealth inequality is a major problem. Whereas, in fact, the key metrics there, whether you look at income inequality or wealth inequality, have actually barely changed over the last 20 years. And we're in no way an outlier compared to the rest of Europe. It's also good we're focused on the specific point about what poverty means as well. I sometimes will ask, a pop question, what do you understand poverty to mean? And most people understand it to mean that some sort of measure of material deprivation, some sort of measure of not being able to pay your bills, which is a concept of absolute poverty, in other words. And I think everybody's against that. However, when people toss numbers around saying there are hundreds of thousands or millions of people in poverty, what they're actually referring to is a measure of relative poverty or income inequality. In other words, people are earning less than a certain amount compared to other people. Now, those sort of relative poverty measures clearly have some use in an economy like the UK. I mean, you wouldn't want to use a global standard like less than $2 a day, because that's clearly meaningless in a relatively well-off economy like the UK. But to focus purely on relative poverty measures rather than thinking about absolute poverty, I think is misleading. What should be the focus is looking at the very poorest people and asking why they are poor. Now, just giving them more money in the short term might be a temporary solution. But at the end of the day, you want to get those people back into work. You want to get them off benefits. You want to get them contributing productively to the economy and therefore being rewarded by that through the markets. But unfortunately, this government's policy isn't that. It's just sort of redistributing from the only slightly better off towards the worse off. You can do that in the short run, but in the long run, it's not sustainable.
Yeah, entirely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the bit on relative poverty was it was very encouraging to have a politician talk about that. I think it's also worth noting, even if you're looking at the issue of poverty from a left-wing perspective, the obsession with the single relative poverty measure, where it's like if you're in a household that's earning less than 60% of the median, um, can actually be a problem, because so say if you have a really, really targeted welfare measure that is targeted at the very, very poorest households that helps them a bit, well, you might be in the perverse situation where it doesn't actually lift any children out of poverty. Let's say if you, for example, are just going off the relative poverty figure of 60%, and you have some measure that will lift families that are on 45% of the median up to 50% of the median, and then it doesn't affect other people. It's, that would have zero effect on child poverty, because no one is getting over that 60% threshold. But the 60% threshold, there is nothing magical about earning 60% of the median. And in fact, as Badenoch pointed out, you can have really weird situations like in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, where lots and lots of people and families and children were immediately lifted out of poverty, but not because they were getting richer, because rather it was because the median wage had dropped because the economy was tanking, and that's something you should at the very, very least bear in mind. But yeah, I mean, in terms of criticisms of this, as you pointed out, there wasn't really any new policy in there, and also there wasn't really any mention of the biggest component of the welfare budget, which is welfare for pensioners, and that is the part of the budget that is growing and expanding, and due to our demographics, it's basically going to become a bigger and bigger part of the welfare budget, and there hasn't really been any attempt to address that by the Conservatives, which is perhaps understandable given how I think it's only over 70s, which are the only group that are plurality supporters of the Conservative Party.
I think a defence and an agreement on that. I think the defence on the policy front, the party 4 years away from a general election has already laid out some headline policies. She didn't say any new policy, but she referred to lots of the cuts that they had laid out that were partly to fund their pledge to abolish stamp duty. I think expecting any more, leaders of the opposition have an impossible job where they need to lay out what they think, create news, get in front of the newspapers and the headlines, without actually dedicating that much policy this far out. So I think that can be excused, and I think that we should welcome, as we have, particularly a politician taking on the relative poverty measure head on in that way is refreshing, and the fact that they clearly think that there's political capital to be made in doing this speech about welfare and getting Britain back to work is a positive sign that maybe things are swinging the other direction. But you're absolutely right that there is still a glaring elephant, sort of over 65-year-old elephant in the room, on the pensions front, and that Kemi is doing a lot of really good work, in my opinion, to sort of do this. We're going to tell the hard truths, and that is slowly starting to bear a bit of fruit. And the Conservative Party historically does quite well when they do that sort of thing, but still they're shying away from the triple lock and the pensions liabilities on the whole. And I'm not optimistic that come the next election that abolishing the triple lock will be on the manifesto. Julian, do you think we can live in hope or not on that front?
Well, I would certainly get rid of it. I think it's important to have an alternative proposal, and mine would probably just be simply to index the state pension in line with inflation, so protecting its real purchasing power. I think that's a relatively easy thing, I think, to explain to people. I think part of the problem now is that if you say that you want to abolish the triple lock, people just say, "Oh, what are you going to do?" And unless you can come up with a credible alternative, people think that they'll lose access to their pension altogether, which would not be the appropriate solution. So I think they should scrap it, but also I think they should make a serious proposal about what the
But I guess pinning it to pinning it to inflation would be a very sensible idea, I think. But then you have the problem again that you could come back that eventually pensioners might be getting relatively poorer if wages grow faster than inflation, and therefore you were back to the relative poverty issue again, aren't we?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, people often ask me, do I care about income inequality, or accuse me of not caring? To which my answer is often, yes, I don't care, to be honest. I care about people in absolute poverty, but income inequality, I think is fine, and actually arguably a healthy part of the economic system. It provides the incentives for people to move up the scale. I don't really think it matters if pensioners fall behind those in work. And by the way, you have to have a long period of them falling behind before people in work actually catch up. Because, of course, a lot of the pensioners we're talking about at the moment, a large majority of them done, relatively well over the last 10, 20 years, either from gains in asset prices or from the pensions triple lock itself. So obviously, there are some relatively poor pensioners who are really struggling. But I would focus my support on them through the benefit system. I would top up pensions credit. I wouldn't try and protect them by what's happening at the moment, which is bigger pension increases for everybody, including people like me in a few years' time who, I'm in a fortunate position. I don't really need the state pension at all. But at the moment, I'll still have it, still be benefiting from the pensions triple lock, regardless of my own personal circumstances.
Exactly. Thank you both for joining us. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. Julian, you've got to go to the GB News. Thank you for both for joining me. Thank you too for listening and or watching. As always, please subscribe to us on YouTube and on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk to get all of our stuff straight to your inbox. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.